On June 19th, 1944, two of Japan's most powerful aircraft carriers were attacked and sunk by lone American submarines. Nearly a quarter of remaining Japanese carrier strength was destroyed in the space of a few hours, making it the most successful day in the history of the US Navy submarine force by tonnage sunk. This is the story of two submarine captains that never gave up and a Japanese carrier fleet that never recovered. By the middle of 1944, the war in the Pacific was steadily swinging towards the United States and its allies. Early Japanese success had given way to relentless Allied counterattack, and in June the Pacific Fleet moved against the Mariana Islands of Saipan and Guam. Ahead of the landing of ground troops, Task Force 58 was sent forward with its 15 aircraft carriers to conduct bombing raids on the islands. This was the moment that the commander of the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, Admiral Ozawa, had been waiting for. For years, the Japanese had carefully conserved its aircraft carriers, hoping to draw the US into a single decisive battle that would turn the tide of a war that seemed to be slipping away. The time for this battle had now arrived, with the US extending the core of its strength into Japanese-held territory. The first mobile fleet set sail from Tawi off Borneo on June 13th and began the voyage to confront the Americans. At the tip of the Japanese spear was Ozawa's Force A, comprised of the veteran carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, as well as Taiho, the Imperial Japanese Navy's newest and most capable aircraft carrier. Commissioned in March 1944, Tahio had the biggest flight deck of any Japanese carrier up to that point and was the first Japanese carrier to feature an armoured flight deck, designed to withstand direct hits by 1,000-pound bombs. She had joined the fleet in May and immediately became Ozawa's flagship for this operation. The Americans were conscious that the Japanese fleet might come out to challenge their attack on the Marianas, and so in preparation, large parts of the Pacific Fleet submarine force, 42 boats in all, had been deployed in the region. When the Japanese sortied on June 13th, within hours the USS Redfin had spotted and reported them, and 2 days later a second force, including the battleship Yamato, was sighted to the east by Seahorse. When Ozawa's main force transited the San Bernardino Strait and was sighted by the USS Flying Fish, it was clear that the Japanese were throwing everything they had into the fight. Over the next couple of days, Ozawa's fleet made steady progress east, with the Admiral trying to arrange air support from Guam and Saipan to aid him when battle was joined with the Americans. But lying between the two fleets was a line of half a dozen submarines. The first to come into contact with the Japanese was the USS Kavala, which was on its way to relieve the Flying Fish from its patrol position near the Philippines. Kavala was the first command of its rookie skipper, Lieutenant Commander Herman Kostler. At 11:03 p.m. on June 16th, it picked up 4 enemy ships on radar approaching from the southwest. It was a group of 4 Japanese tankers, which would soon be rendezvousing with Ozawa's fleet to refuel it. Kostler quickly ordered his boat to dive to make an attack, but was foiled by an alert escorting destroyer and forced to go deep. By the time Kavala could resurface early on the morning of June 17th, the Japanese ships had vanished. Frustrated, Kostler reported what had happened and set off in pursuit, spending the next 13 hours hunting for any signs of enemy vessels. Finally, that evening Kavala met with success, with radar picking up at least 8 Japanese vessels coming up from the west. Mindful that an attempted attack last time had seriously delayed him reporting the location of the hostile fleet, Kostler chose this time to submerge and wait for the enemy to pass by before popping up to transmit their location to Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood. Lockwood was frustrated by this decision and told Kostler that he would have preferred the rookie submarine skipper to always press an attack before worrying about passing intel up the chain. Every chance to attack the enemy had to be seized. Lieutenant Commander Kostler had now seen 2 Japanese groups slip through his fingers, and he must have felt some pressure to make his next opportunity count. Meanwhile, Admiral Ozawa's fleet continued to close on the Americans. On June 18th, both sides launched air reconnaissance, but only the Japanese made contact with their opponents, while the Americans grappled with an uncertain intelligence picture. The Japanese admiral decided that the time had come. The following day would see an all-out attack, 430 aircraft launched in 4 waves, which with hoped-for support from land-based aircraft would aim to cripple the American fleet. As the largest battle between aircraft carriers in history loomed, Vice Admiral Lockwood moved 4 more submarines into what was believed to be the Japanese fleet's path. One of these, Commander Jim Blanchard's USS Ahlberg, raised its periscope on the morning of June 19th to find itself just to the southeast of Force A. Blanchard swung his boat around and began to close on the Japanese fleet, settling on the Taiho as his prime target. The range steadily came down. By 8:01, Ahlberg was penetrating the escort screen and Blanchard turned his boat briefly to allow a Japanese destroyer to pass ahead, oblivious of the presence of the American submarine. Turning back to close on the carriers, Blanchard brought the range down to under 2,000 yards and prepared to fire. Just as he did so, Ahlberg's torpedo computer malfunctioned, forcing the captain to use the backup aiming device, commonly known as the Mark I eyeball. At 8:09 am, Blanchard loosed all 6 bow torpedoes from a range of 1,600 yards. Ahlberg was almost immediately jumped by 3 Japanese destroyers and forced down with depth charges, but it was too late. As the torpedoes streaked towards their target, they were spotted by Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just gotten airborne in his dive bomber. Without hesitation, Komatsu swung his aircraft around and put it into a steep dive. He ploughed into one of the torpedoes, detonating it prematurely. It was a stunning act of self-sacrifice, but despite Komatsu's best efforts and the malfunction of Ahlberg's torpedo computer, 1 torpedo remained stubbornly on target. At 8:10 am, it slammed into the starboard side of Taiho. The carrier shook from the explosion, which opened a hole in the ship's side just below the waterline at the base of the forward elevator. This ruptured fuel tanks located just below, allowing a mix of seawater, gasoline and fuel oil to pour into the elevator well. To make matters worse, the shock wave of the explosion broke one of the pulleys holding the elevator itself up, and it collapsed on one side, jamming in place and rendering the flight deck inoperable. It was a frustrating setback for Admiral Ozawa, who could well do without one of his best carriers being out of action for hours while repairs were made. Though Taiho had launched all of her strike aircraft, there were still some fighters on board to provide combat air patrol against any American attacks, and Ozawa wanted the carrier functional as quickly as possible. To speed up Taiho's return to flight operations, the ship's captain, Tomozo Kikuchi, ordered the forward elevator be patched over with whatever wood could be found. The concern of the admiral and captain here was solely for getting Taiho back in the fight. The idea that this 1 torpedo hit should endanger the ship's survival would have been bizarre. It had missed all of the ship's engine rooms and other important machinery, and the amount of flooding in the elevator well was minor for a ship of this size. Taiho's speed was reduced slightly, but it was otherwise seemingly unaffected. By 9:20 am, damage control parties had managed to patch over the elevator well, cannibalizing tables, benches, and anything else wooden they could get their hands on. It was here that the problems for Taiho multiplied. With the elevator sealed off, gasoline fumes coming off the fuel-water mix were contained within the ship, and gradually began to build up. Meanwhile, less than 3 hours after the attack on Taiho, a second American submarine spotted Ozawa's carrier force. It was the USS Kavala, which had kept up a dogged pursuit of the Japanese fleet since Lieutenant Commander Kostler had let it slip by the previous day. Kostler now took his boat in from the south, determined to press home and attack. Just like Ahlberg before, Kavala managed to sneak through the thin Japanese escort and at 11:18 am fire 6 torpedoes towards the closest carrier, Shokaku. It was a perfect setup, at close range and with a functional torpedo computer. 4 of these 6 torpedoes crashed into the starboard side of Shokaku while it was in the middle of refueling and rearming aircraft for another attack. In quick succession, the carrier's forward aviation fuel tanks were hit, followed by engine rooms, the forward magazine and the bow section, which was completely cut through. The sea rushed in and Shokaku began to rapidly heel over. Fires raged from the aviation fuel tanks and threatened to detonate the magazine. At 12:10 p.m, there was an explosion as ordnance began to cook off, and the carrier's speed quickly dropped. It soon became clear that the damage was unsurvivable. Shortly after 3 p.m, Shokaku rolled over and sank, with the loss of 1,272 out of 1,840 sailors. It was the end for one of Japan's most distinguished carriers, which had fought in major battles going all the way back to Pearl Harbor. It was a devastating blow for Admiral Ozawa, and the Admiral's day was about to get even worse, without the Americans even doing anything more. The problem was the Taiho, whose damage control teams now found themselves fighting a losing battle against gasoline fumes. Repair parties had donned gas masks and moved into the elevator well to try and repair cracks in the fuel tanks, but this had been unsuccessful, and before long the gas masks were overwhelmed and sailors began to pass out from inhaling the toxic fumes. Before long, the whole of the lower hangar deck was thick with it and had to be abandoned. With the situation getting worse by the minute, Captain Kikuchi decided to take drastic action to try and clear the fumes from the hangar decks. He ordered the ship's ventilation system turned on, all doors and hatches opened, and the aft elevator lowered, to try and get a draft moving through the ship to dispel the fumes. But not only did this not work, it had the effect of spreading the toxic air throughout the whole ship. Kikuchi soon had to issue orders forbidding the lighting of any fires on board, and the repair crews switched to wearing rubber shoes to lessen the chance of a rogue spark. But at 12 p.m, with the ship reeking of gasoline, Taiho began to recover aircraft that had flown off earlier that morning. This required the aft elevator to be raised for most of the time to form part of the flight deck, effectively sealing the ship up for long periods and intensifying the problem. Taiho was now a floating 30,000-ton bomb. At 2:32 p.m, the inevitable happened. There was a huge explosion on one of the hangar decks as a spark somewhere ignited the thick fuel vapours. Taiho's armoured flight deck, designed to protect it from explosions above, now deflected much of the blast back into the ship, magnifying its intensity and causing carnage. Enormous fires broke out, and the carrier's engines soon stopped working. Taiho quickly drew to a halt, listing and burning. It was soon obvious that any attempts to save the ship were futile, and abandoned ship was ordered. Admiral Ozawa and Captain Kikuchi were initially determined to go down with the ship, as was often the case with senior Japanese officers, but both in the end were persuaded to move to the cruiser Haguro, which came alongside to pick up survivors. At 4:28 p.m, Taiho capsized and sank. Of a crew of 2,038, 660 men went with her. Taiho's loss capped a miserable day for Admiral Ozawa and the Japanese. As well as the carriers, the Imperial Navy had lost hundreds of carrier aircraft, and with it any remaining hope they had of turning the tide of the Pacific War. For the Americans, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had been a triumph, for naval aviation but also for submarines. June 19, 1944 saw the highest amount of tonnage sunk by US submarines in a single day, eclipsing even the demise of another big Japanese carrier a few months later. I hear there is a good video on YouTube about that particular sinking. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.